The merchants of death would be more scared of processed food than they were even of their own cigarettes. It was so revealing.
In this episode, I'm going to introduce you to a brilliant man that probably actually doesn't need an introduction, Michael Moss.
Down deep, we all still see these products as our friends.
Michael Moss, the author of Salt, Sugar and Fat, has been investigating the food industry for many years.
They know better. They don't eat their own products.
Michael has written some amazing books around food addiction. His latest book, Hooked, is one of my absolute favorites. He's also a New York Times bestseller, #1 author with Salt, Sugar and Fat, a brilliant book that everybody should rush out and buy to really understand and learn more about food addiction. Let me also just tell a little bit more about our conference. At the conference, these experts got on stage and in front of an audience, and we hired the Royal College of General Practitioners in London, and my team also filmed the conference and sort of beamed it out live to hundreds of other experts watching. But all these experts come along to explain what type of foods are addictive, what processes are addictive, and together the organisers over the coming years are going to put a consensus together to really help the world understand what is driving so much chronic illness, so much stress, so much metabolic illness, so much obesity. They're going to show us the tricks, the techniques and the foods that are actually doing that. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. In this episode, Michael Moss will start by seeing him on stage, and then we'll see him off stage as we have a chat in the green room.
I've been crawling through the underbelly of this creature we call the processed food industry for 15 years now, and I've met some really interesting people who might help you kind of frame this question of food addiction. And I have to confess that kind of my own attitudes about this question have changed over the years, because when Salt, Sugar, Fat came out in 2013, the New York Times ran a headline, a big excerpt in the headline was the extraordinary science of addictive junk food. And I have to say I cringed at the word addictive because I refrained from using it in Salt, Sugar, Fat. The word felt too harsh to me. And frankly, I confess if you had asked me then whether I thought Twinkies were comparable to heroin, I would have said that's totally ridiculous. And granted, if you've had time to spend with that first book, Salt, Sugar, Fat, you would have hung out with some people who dedicated their entire lives, careers, and then had considerable misgivings about that in designing and marketing food products, not just to get us to like them, but to want more and more of them. And yeah, there was Howard Moskowitz, this math nerd from Harvard, who realized he could drive us crazy with things like spaghetti sauce simply by adding very precise amounts of sugar. Howard was the person who coined the term the Bliss Point to describe that. And of course, the problem is that Howard, in creating many of the biggest icons for the food industry, then encouraged the food industry to march around the store, engineering bliss points for products that didn't used to be sweet, like bread and yogurt and the spaghetti sauce. And I asked Howard about the bliss point. He goes, well, what would you have called it? The moderately interesting range of delight? No, it's the bliss point, of course. I got to hang out with people like Jeffrey Dunn. For years, one of the fiercest warriors at Coca-Cola in their competition with Pepsi. Jeff rose to become president of Coca-Cola for North America, South America. And he walked me through kind of the deep psychology that goes into the marketing of products and why part of his fierceness was fighting for pouring rights in ballparks, knowing that if they could get a Coke in the hands of a kid when they're with their parents having the most joyful moment of their life, that Coke will forevermore be associated with joy and happiness. And I think that was one of Chris's slides, as Coca-Cola's trademark slogan for the rest of their lives, because of the power of these products have to sort of get inside our memories. I also hung out with another Jeffrey Bible, CEO of Philip Morris, which, as Chris mentioned, for many, many years, at a really critical time, was the single largest producer of processed food, at least in North America, through its acquisition of the old company General Foods, and then Kraft, and eventually Nabisco. And Bible walked me through what he felt was Philip Morris's and the tobacco industry's greatest contribution to the success of processed food products. And yeah, there was some sort of marketing cunning in terms of positioning the grocery store, but really what Philip Morris brought was truckloads of cash and bravado. And one of my favorite examples of that is another person I spent time with, Bob Drain. He invented the Lunchables, which you guys don't have here. I was looking for one in the store here to show you, but basically it's a modern day industrial version of a bento box that Kraft invented back in the very early 80s, needing to find a new way to sell processed cheese and processed ham. And it was Bob Drain and his marketing genius team which came up with the Lunchables. But up until that point, these food companies were rather, and we're talking early 80s, were rather risk averse. And so Bob, in order to, having invented the prototype of the Lunchables, needed money to market and expand it nationally. So he got on a plane, came to New York, met with the tobacco chiefs who owned his company, Kraft, and presented the Lunchables, and they looked at him sort of dumbfounded. It was like, Bob, why are you so timid? I mean, you've just invented something that will drive people nuts with irresistibly, here's a blank check, knock yourself out. And I also say that, I was also incredibly lucky to come across this trove of internal emails and white papers and strategy sessions that really kind of puts us at the table of these companies as they were inventing and marketing and positioning their products in the grocery store. And the overwhelming sense you get from that material is that this is an industry driving 24/7 to make their products irresistible. I mean, even the language that they use to describe those efforts is so fascinating. I mean, they hate the A word, addiction, mind you, but they love the word engineering craveability into their products, or snackability, or one of my favorites, more-ishness, a word they use. And granted, these are not English majors, these are bench chemists and marketing people describing those efforts. One of my favorite terms, which I should mention, is the vanishing caloric density, which is their term to describe what happens if you put a cheese puff into your mouth and press the tongue against the roof of the mouth. That cheese puff, being 50% of the calories coming from fats, is designed to melt, and they realize through their own research that in that process, that melting sends a signal to the brain saying, hey, cheese puff just disappeared along with the calories, you might as well keep eating the rest of the bag, Michael. For years and years, Philip Morris and the other companies vehemently resisted the idea that smoking was addictive. And then something happened, and they were successful at that in courts. And then something happened in 1995, I think it was, a jury in Florida ruled against Philip Morris, awarded a huge amount of money to a victim of smoking. And in their decision, they had bought the idea for the first time that smoking is addictive, and that led the tobacco industry to undergo its, substantial reforms and settlement with the state attorneys general. And I think, from what I'm hearing here and other places, you guys are getting pretty close to that point where, a jury in Florida or Kansas is going to start looking at these products indeed as addictive and something that the industry at least has a shared responsibility and culpability for.
Wasn't that fascinating? Right, next, let's go to the green room where I talked to Michael again about that link between the big cigarette companies and the food industry.
Your story about, and if you could share it with everybody, about the gentleman from Philip Morris who was smoking the one a day, and then his relationship with the Oreos, which he was then creating. Maybe you could just tell everybody that story.
Yeah, I mean, one of the reasons I hung out with the Philip Morris people was that they were the first to sort of privately turn to their food managers when they were the biggest manufacturer of processed food in North America and warned them. This is all the way back in the year 2000, 2001, that the food side of their business was going to face as much trouble over salt, sugar, fat, obesity, type 2 diabetes. And the tobacco guys urged the food guys to start reducing their dependency on using so much salt, sugar, fat, and other additives in their products in order to avoid that trouble that was coming down the road. So that's why I kind of spent time. But yes, I was talking to the former general counsel of Philip Morris about this question of food and addiction. And he pointed out to me that, Michael, I'm one of those lucky people who can smoke one cigarette a day, put the pack away, and never have any compulsion to pull it out again until the next day. There's actually a lot of people who do that. The industry calls them chippers. But, he says, I couldn't go near a bag of our Oreo cookies, which Philip Morris owned at the time because it owned Nabisco, which makes Oreos, for fear of losing control and eating half the bag in one sitting. And I really don't know what it is about those Oreos that was doing that. It was probably the sugar, or maybe, as you've looked at, maybe it was the lack of good things like fiber. But the fact that, the merchants of death, as the tobacco industry is known, would be more scared of processed food than they were even of their own cigarettes was so revealing.
Maybe he should have gone to his own R&D department, because Stephen Whitley, who we talked about before off camera, said he coined the phrase Oreo sensory and Oreo sensory from Stephen Whitley's point of view was the fact the brain loves hard then soft, cold then warm, and he called it after the word Oreos. So that's one of the many tricks I guess they play.
Yeah, but I think he sort of instinctually understood that too, the former general counsel. I mean, because he loved to hold cigarettes as much as he loved to eat them. And that's a huge part of processed foods like Oreo cookies too. Yeah. The feeling of just kind of holding it in your hand and then putting it in your mouth. And as Stephen refers to, the dynamic contrast between the crunchy cookie and the soft, gooey filling and the black and the white are huge drivers of our attraction to food.
And that's so true. And you've spoken to so many of these big food companies. What give us two or three other sort of things that just shocked you that they do, some of their techniques that maybe they do, and why are our kids getting so obese?
Yeah, well, I mean, one thing that surprised me is that they don't eat their own products. They know better, especially, well, first off, they're at a level where their spouse maybe doesn't have to work outside the home, and so that person can take care of scratch cooking and home cooking for the family. They don't need to rely on processed food like so many other people do. But also when they get in trouble with their health, a former chief technical officer for Kraft told me that he used to jog for exercise, and then he blew out his knee and couldn't, and the very first thing he did was to stop eating many of his own company's products as a way of controlling his intake of calories. That's really surprising. I was also surprised to find out that these companies are adding sort of huge amounts of salt, sugar, fat to their products, not just for taste, to make products that otherwise taste like straw, taste like something, but for industrial purposes because of the machinery that they use. And in some ways, I realize that they're more dependent on these additives than we are. And so going forward, it really begs the question, to what extent can we rely on these companies to play a meaningful role going forward? It's tempting to invite them to the table. They have so much expertise in how our brain works and how allure works. But again, they're stuck, needing, in their view, needing to create products that are super cheap, super convenient, and will make a lot of money for shareholders in a short amount of time.
Yeah, it's interesting. You had a question from the audience about, it's a shame that real food is more expensive. And you also, I've heard you say several times before, and I can't remember whether I read it in your book or you said if I had 10 things I could go in and do. And one of the things I would pose a question to you about, because you talked about educated at school level. Yes, meal for meal, maybe real food is more expensive. But if it removes the need to snack in between, because you're not on that roller coaster of loads of sugar and then crashing and then having to have 11 o'clock snacks and then 2 o'clock. So in theory, the overall spend of the day probably goes down, not up.
Yeah, I think it's good...
It's kind of, how do we get that message out?
Well, I think that's maybe we need some more an economic look at that, because for different families it might sort of play out differently. But I think that's a really huge point. And I've seen pushback from that. There are people who can design menus for families of wholesome eating that doesn't cost more. And in fact does. I mean, the spaghetti sauce I make at home from scratch costs less than the prepared spaghetti sauce in the aisle. So I definitely think that in many ways that's true. I just think we need more people doing more home economist type people crunching the numbers and writing about that.
And that's just so true. We need the data, the facts, put it in front of people. The problem we've got here in the UK is food suddenly, it's come back down a bit now, but we had the situation last year where real food, like eggs, were almost doubling in price, over a few months. But you're right, we need to get the data clear in front of people that goes, if you're having your crisps in between meals here and you're having, the Coca-Cola later on rather than just plain water, you add that all up together, your basket is still more expensive than you had 2 or 3 wholesome meals that maybe you cooked.
But it's more than just the data. It's more than just putting facts in front of people. Life is so crazy now, and people are so filled with facts and overwhelmed by reality that one has to find new ways of communicating these things to people in order to get them to find the time to pay attention to it. So, and again, the food giants control that. They control the marketing. They control the influencers. Sports celebrities don't push broccoli on advertising. They push soda.
Drives me mad. You've heard of David Beckham. I love David Beckham. Well, I did till about a month ago. I've now seen even David Beckham that doesn't need the money is now promoting Walker's crisps. I mean, it's just so sad.
Yeah,
sad.
The only exception to that I can remember is Tom Brady of the Patriots football team, who, came out a few years ago and basically said soda is poison. Of course I don't drink soda. I care about my health and my strength, which is like, what? That's phenomenal. But he's like one of the exceptions to the rule. Everybody else takes the money. And that has such a huge influence on kids, especially. Yeah.
Last question for you. And so 20, 30 years ago, I'm nearly 60, everybody was smoking. And I think one of the things we've all missed about how we turned smoking on its head, that it became, of course, governments did lots of things. You couldn't smoke indoors, in pubs, and all those sort of things did make a difference. But I think one of the big things that changed the consumers thing was they started to hate the manufacturers for adding those addictive stuffs and adding the stuff that was poisoning people. So they started sticking the 2 fingers up, if you like, at the manufacturers. In other words, they were rebelling against it. They started to hate the fact that they were becoming addicted because of the chemicals and the tar and everything that was going in. Is that part of the solution to make people rebel against what Nestle are putting into the foods and, making them more aware of the story, what they were doing with children milk formula and getting people to go, I'm not going to buy something from Nestle. I'm going to, go down the broccoli aisle or pick up a celeriac. And most people don't even know what a celeriac is when I did my bit of research, but.
Maybe. But one of the differences with food is that, down deep, we all still see these products which we grew up with as kids as our friends, right? It's different than tobacco. Down deep, Twinkies and Pop-Tarts, it's really hard to imagine kind of people taking to the streets and marching against, these highly processed food products.
Very good point.
For Black Lives Matters or for any other kind of climate change, right?
Yeah.
And so one of the things I think that really helped drive change in smoking habits, though, was the tax on cigarettes. And you start to see that in food, right? There are a couple of cities or states in the United States, there are a couple of countries who have imposed sort of an excess sugar tax on sugary products. And that seems to work in terms of just nudging people just a little bit into reducing their purchasing of them. Because we love money as much as we love junk food instinctually. And so I think that you could have some economic drivers there too that would help change people's minds, beyond sort of demonizing and beyond the warning labels on products.
You're so true. In fact, let's just remind about I was with Richard Branson. We were walking up the Himalayas, and I said to Richard, "What's your biggest mistake?" And he said, he thought about it for a while. He said, when I tried to launch my own cola, he said, we did all the research, we got taste testing, it was better than Pepsi, it was better than Coke, and we were convinced that Virgin Cola was going to be the next big thing in the UK. And he said, but that wasn't the mistake. So what the mistake was, when Coke flew a jumbo jet over full of cash to buy off every supermarket to get his Coke out of the shops, no consumer kicked up a fuss. Because he said, when I normally take on a brand, he used to fight like British Airways, he always picked a fight with somebody that wasn't that popular with the public. But he said, when he picked the fight with Coke, because even though his was a better taste and it was all, it just tasted better, even though it was the same price, and even though people were buying it, when it was stripped out of the supermarkets, nobody batted an eyelid because nobody hates Coke. So your point is absolutely right.
Yeah.
It is hard to demonize them when it's the brands that we've grown up with, some of them.
And it's also true that we all think we shop for health, or a lot of us do, but by and large, when we walk into the grocery store, we're looking at taste, yumminess, and then cheapness as the two driving things that will in terms of our decision making about what to buy or not. Health is like down the list. So that's the other challenge.
Well, I hope you really enjoyed that podcast. The next podcast is going to be with Chris Van Tullicum, who also attended the conference, who I also caught backstage. And if you're not aware of Chris, before the episode comes out, go and buy his book, Ultra Processed People. Chris is a brilliant commentator on the BBC, and together we're going to expand on this idea of food addiction.